yourself. Right now our site is static. The reason it's static is because we declare everything and it's not really being updated or changed by anyone, right? Even the admin has nothing to do with what's currently going on our different views as well as our URLs. Now, this is fine if that's all you really want, but Django really shines when we start making it dynamic. That is, having data stored in a database that we add to and we can actually see. So there's like that interchange of data, right? So like think of like Instagram, for example. When you post something, you're adding to the Instagram's database. Django does that really, really well, which is why Instagram uses it, right? Like, or has used it in the past. So if we jump into our settings file, right? So scrolling down a little bit to installed apps, these are the things that make Django that much more dynamic. And there's a lot of things built in by default, right? We've already seen the Django admin. We've seen our auth user, so our actual user that's logged in, right? So this user, right? We've seen sessions too. Sessions are if I open up another tab, I still see that user in there, right? And we can also log out that user with sessions. There's a few other ones that I'm not going to cover right now, but the idea here is that Django has a lot of this stuff built in and they work out of the box. But what if we wanted to add our own thing? And that's what we need to do now. But I will say that they're called apps, but I like to think of them as components, right? So these are all little pieces that build up to the Django project as a whole, right? Don't think of them in terms of apps like your mobile apps or the fact that this entire project could be called a web app. Like, don't think of it in those terms. Think of them as little tiny components that build up your larger project, right? I think that's a better term than apps because of just what convention for apps is now. Everyone thinks of apps in terms of your mobile phone. But when it comes to Django, the apps are the components. And these components or these apps integrate and can integrate into our database, and that's what we need to do. So let's go into our terminal, and we're going to close out the server here, and we'll list everything out. And I'm just going to run python manage.py and hit enter. And what we see here is there's a bunch of Django-related things. We've seen migrate, we've seen start project. Now there's the one that we're going to use, which is start app. That's really useful if you forget what things are. So python manage.py, start app, and I'm going to call this blog. We're building a blogging application. So I'm going to call this app blog, and I want to keep it very, very narrow in focus, right? So really, it would probably be better to call it blog posts because it's related to all of my blog posts. But I'm going to keep it as blog because writing out blog_posts over and over again just gets very tedious. So let's keep it in as blog. And there we go. So now if anyone went to my code, they would see that, hey, I have an app called blog. And in this, it actually already built a bunch of things for me. It has a models file. It has a views file. It has an admin file. Those are the three main ones that we'll look at. We will also look at tests too. But the main thing here is understanding that, yes, now we have something called models. And what models do is it allows us to store data in the database in a very specific way. Let's look at an absolutely basic version of that. And I'll say class. And this has to be a class. It cannot be a function. And what we're going to call it is simply blog post. And it's models.model. Okay. So what this does is it allows us to declare fields that are going to be mapped into the database, but more importantly, something that's logical for the data that we need, right? So if I said title, well, that certainly makes sense for a blog post. And then I need to declare what this field is. And we do that with models. Let's just call it text field for now. That's it. That's all I'm going to leave for my model. So now I've got a new app and a new model. The rule of thumb is whenever you change to models.py, you have to do at least two things. One of those things is inside of settings, make sure that your app is there, right? So after you do that once, you probably are good. right? The other thing is we need to ensure that this is in our database. And also any changes that I made to this are also in our database. So these two commands will be what you always run after models.py. And that is Python manage.py make migrations. And you might see something like this, right? So it made migrations. The next thing you would do is Python manage.py migrate. So those are the two commands that you'll always run. Make migrations and migrate. So if I wanted to add something here and said like content, save it. This time I'm going to go ahead and say null equals to true and blank equals to true. No worries, we'll talk about that soon. Let's go ahead and save it. What do? We run make migrations and then we run migrate. This ensures that what's on our model is also what's known in the database. So the database now knows about this model and we can start adding to it. But how do we do that? What I'm going to do is some real quick Python class understanding. So I'm going to make a new class here and just write blog. I'm not going to pass anything. You can pass the object, but that's inferred that it's an object. So you can write that if you like, or you can just leave it empty. I'll say title equals to hello world and content equals to something cool. Okay, so this is not Django. This is just pure Python. So if I go into the Python shell, just plain old Python shell, no need to do manage.py, and I copy this in here and I run obj equals to blog, obj2 equals to blog with those parentheses. I now have two objects, also known as an instance. So obj and obj2, those are also instances of this blog class or this blog object. So if I do obj, I should see something like this. If I do obj.title, I should see that. obj2.title, right? We should see all of these things. And then obj.__ class, we should see the actual class, the same as what we declared for it, right? So Django models aren't actually a whole lot different than this, but instead of retrieving the data after we initialize it, we can actually use it in the database. So in other words, if I said obj2.title equals to another title and did obj2.save, that would then save it in the database. Now, of course, this default class doesn't do that, but Django has that in by default. So if I do obj2.title, of course it's showing me .title. But if I exit out of here and go back into Python and try to type out obj.2, it's not even defined, right? Blog's not even defined. Like none of those things are defined. Now, of course, I assume that you know this. If you don't know it, that was a nice little introduction to how classes work. And if you do know it, it's a really easy way to save data into the database. All right, so let's get rid of this example, save everything here. I'm going to exit out of this Python interpreter and then now go into the Django version with python manage.py shell. And then we're going to go ahead and import this class. So we'll do from blog.models import blog, or rather blog post, right? So it's that model. Now, if you're not familiar with how to get here, let me know in the comments, but it's really simple. We're starting this in manage.py, so the root of the Django project, which if we break everything down, Pythonically, Python manage.py can go into the blog with from blog, right? So that's a Python module itself. The blog module is in there because of that init file. So we can do from blog.models, import that blog post. Now I can go ahead and say obj equals to blog post, obj.title equals to this is my title, and obj.content equals to this is my content, and then obj.save. This time it's saying that it's missing the requirement for self. Of course it is. I didn't initialize that instance very well. And there we go. Now I go ahead and save it. And what do you know? Does it seem like anything happened? Well, let's exit out of the shell and go back into the shell. import that again. And then we're going to do a query. So we're going to actually look in the back end, and I'll say obj equals to blog post.objects.get title equals to, well, this string right here. And if I do obj.title, there it is, obj.content, and there it is. Right? So what did I do? I actually imported that object, created an instance of it correctly here, and then I saved that instance into the database, and then I exited out of the shell, and then went in and retrieved it from the database. So I can do that also with the Django admin. So I was able to save this data. Let's go ahead and add the blog model, the blog post model, into the admin so I can do it there. And we're going to go ahead and do from.models, right? So the models module and the admin module are in the same module. So you can do a relative import, and then we do import blog post, and then we just do admin.site.register blog post. That's how you actually bring it into the admin. That has been convention for a long time. And that's how you do it. Okay, so our model is named blog post. If you named it something different, it's completely okay. Typically with models, you don't want to name it with a plural because you'll have a lot of instances of that object or that actual model, like we kind of started doing. We already have one instance, so it makes a lot more sense to do blog post. Okay, so this adds it to the admin. Let's go ahead and take a look. I'm going to exit out of that shell, and I'm going to run the server again. And in our project, we'll go into the admin, and what do you know? I've got blog post in here. If I click on it, I have my first blog post. It has title and content. Not a whole lot of data going on here, but that's pretty cool. The next thing is I'll just make a new one called Hello World as my title, and my content being just like ABC. Save that. I now have two objects in the database. Let's go ahead and query the database for those objects. Let's go into the shell. So Python manage.py shell. We're going to go ahead and do from blog.models import blog post. And we'll go ahead and say obj equals to blog post.objects.get title equals to hello world. I'm going off of memory here. I hit obj. I don't actually have a title matching that query. So maybe it was a lowercase w. Looks like that worked. So I can do obj.title, and sure enough, there it is. Now, there are more complex ways to actually look up this data, which we'll get into later. But as you see, it has a way to say does not exist and a way to actually get it if I did the right query. Now, another thing that's built into all models is an ID field. So obj.id, that's what these numbers signify. It actually shows me the ID of that object that gets automatically incremented every time you save a new object. So let's go ahead and save another object. I'll say obj2, or rather obj3 equals to blog post, and then we'll initialize it. obj3.title equals to this is awesome again, or something like that. obj3.save. Notice I did not save or put any content in there. And now I can exit out of this, and let's press up a few times, run that server again, refresh in here, and sure enough, there are my three objects. So now that we have a way to store data in the database, it's time to actually view this data inside of a view. Now I showed you some methods on how to actually look up this data in the shell, right? So if we click on any of them in the admin, we see that there's that number there, right? So that's that ID that it has by default, and every single one of them has that. So I actually want to reference this blog post now from this ID. That's how I'm going to actually grab this data. So let's go into Sublime Text and into blog views, and I'm going to go ahead and import the blog model, and it's a relative import, so I can do from.models import blog post. And the object I want to grab is the blog post.objects.get, and I'll just say ID equals to 1. And I know that that exists because if I go into the admin, I can see that there's this object and the ID is actually listed there and it says 1. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually use this data in a view. Now you may remember to create a view, we define a function here, and then we'll just go ahead and call this blog post detail page, and it takes in request as a default, and then returns render request, some template name, and some context. So let's actually make those as variables. I'll say template name and context, just like that. So it's a context dictionary and a template name string. So what are we going to call the template name? Well, hey, why don't we just call it blogpostdetail.html? Actually, I think that makes sense. You call it the same thing as the view itself, right? With the exception of the last part. But now I know I can infer that this is absolutely a template. And then I just grab in this query, right? And the nice thing too is I can actually pass in the entire object into this context. Right, so what I mean by that is I don't actually have to do like object.title and say title is equal to that. This passing of the object means that in my template, I can actually unpack what's inside of that object as well. So to actually make this work, of course, we have to create the template. And then what else do we have to do? We have to add this view into our URLs. So inside of my templates, I'm going to go ahead and make a new file in here and call it blog_post_detail.html. Oops, I got to make sure it's the correct extension. Okay. And if it wasn't the correct extension, it would still most likely render, because as long as the template name is right and it's treated as HTML, it should work just fine. So as a reminder, we do extends base.html, and then we put in our block content in block. Okay, so back into our view, the context dictionary tells me the context variable is object. So now I can just do something like h1, curly brackets, object.title, h1, and then maybe like a p tag, object.content. Now, if you don't remember these, the dot notation, dot whatever, is coming from the field names, right? So I have two fields in here, so that allows me to do that dot notation in the template as well. It's not really any different than what we were doing in the shell when we were doing obj.title, right? It's the same thing. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that, we've got a template, we've got a view, it's time to add this into our URLs. So into our URLs, we will add this view. So from blog.views, import, and we'll import that detail view, or that blog post detail page. And of course, it's not a relative import this time around, right? It's relative for the project, of course. So I have to actually go to the blog module itself and then import the views like that. And now what I'll do is add another path here, and I'll just call it blog, and it'll render out this detail page. So we save that, and let's go look at it. Just going into blog, and sure enough, I got this is my title, this is my content. If I want to change that, I go back into my view, and I change the ID that it looks up by. Then I refresh in here. Looks like it's the same content. And then the third one is different content. Cool, so we now have a way to actually look at that detail. It's really not that complicated. It's pretty cool. And we also know that this database that's driving this data, right? So this query right here, that's what it is. It's called a query. That goes into the database. The database returns the data, and then Django renders it. That's essentially what's going on here.